Noel Edmonds leads off Tuesday night on One when he questions two more families of telly addicts. Then at 7:30, EastEnders and Life's Difficult for Den.
I told you, I never said anything, old Bill.
That's what you say. Other people say different.
Well, put a word in with me. You know me long enough. Tell him it's a load of old cobblers.
No can do, Danny boy.
At 8 o'clock, Basil gives Manuel a pick-me-up.
Get on with your meals.
In A Question of Sport at 8:30, joining captains Ian and Bill are boxer Lloyd Hannigan and soccer star John Aldridge. At 9:30, Pearl and Finn are south of the border.
Two jokers on your payroll now.
Well, I like to encourage new talent.
The talented meerkats of the Kalahari Desert are the subject of an award-winning Wildlife on One at 10:25. Network at 5 to 11 discusses television sport. And with the search for realism at 11:45, that's Tuesday night on One.
And on London Plus at 6:30, a 7-year-old's appeal for help in her fight for life. Campaigners against blood sports open a new battlefront, and London Zoo's plan for a brave new future.
The Tuesday Western, over on 2 in a minute, stars Charles Bronson as a wagon train guide in Guns of Diablo. This is BBC1.
The 6 o'clock news from the BBC with Nicholas Witchell and Laurie Mayer.
Good evening. The headlines at 6 o'clock. The National Health Service is to get an extra £2 billion next year. The news was given by the Chancellor in his autumn statement. But Mr Lawson's had to treble his forecast for the trade gap and agreed that inflation will be higher than he predicted in the spring. For Labour, Gordon Brown said the Chancellor had compounded rather than corrected the errors of his budget. Mrs Thatcher has told her backbench rebels many people want to pay for teeth and eye checks, but she still faces a close vote this evening. Also tonight, the Israeli general election, but will there be a clear winner? What to do with the waste, the short list of sites for nuclear dumps. And the Afghan city where the Russians and the rebels have done a deal. The Chancellor of the Exchequer gave his customary autumn report on the state of the economy to the House of Commons this afternoon. It was a chance for him to correct several of the more optimistic forecasts he'd made in his budget about the rate of inflation and the size of the country's trade deficit. It was a chance also for the Chancellor to announce an extra £2 billion worth of spending on the National Health Service in the coming financial year. Mr Lawson told the House the extra £2 billion was by far the largest increase the NHS has ever received. But Labour's spokesman on Treasury matters, Gordon Brown, said that although he welcomed any additional resources, the extra money would barely cover basic inflationary pressures. On the broader question of the health of the British economy, the Chancellor told the House it was strong and sound, despite inflation which he conceded would exceed 6%. Mr Brown told him the economic prospects he'd promised the country in the spring in his budget were not the realities the country faced in the autumn.
After weeks of tense bargaining by the big spending departments, the government's autumn statement was approved this morning by members of the Cabinet. Kenneth Clarke, the Health Secretary, had pressed for more money, and after some tough talking, he got results. But John Major, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, has on the whole shown great skill in coaxing ministers into accepting less than they'd asked for. He's limited the increase in public spending, and his political fortunes are riding high. The Chancellor left for the Commons knowing that he had some explaining to do, with rising inflation and a worrying current account deficit. But he maintained that the government's present strategy was achieving results.
The public finances are in substantial surplus and will remain so, with public spending on priority programs continuing to increase, while overall public spending continues to fall as a share of GDP to a level in 1991-92 not seen for a quarter of a century.
The Chancellor announced that public spending this year at £153 billion is less than anticipated because of money gained from privatisation. Next year's total has not been increased from the original plans. But Mr. Lawson declared that certain departments would gain from a shifting of resources. Health will get £2 billion over and above what is needed for the nurses' pay rise. Plans to build and repair roads will get an extra £200 million, and Defence gets an additional £150 million.
Mr. Speaker, this is an autumn statement which compounds rather than corrects the errors of the budget. It is an autumn statement which condemns an already congested Britain to further deteriorations in our public services. It is an autumn statement which, by the neglect of investment and a policy of high interest rates, leaves the British economy ill-equipped and ill-prepared for the challenges of the 90s.
Conservative backbenchers were pleased with most of Mr. Lawson's news, but silent when he announced that the balance of payments deficit this year will be £13 billion, far higher than the £4 billion he forecast in his budget. He claimed that the continued vigour of the economy was attracting more imports.
What the Chancellor has had to come to the House of Commons today and admit is that he has the highest inflation rate of our competitors in Europe, that he has the highest real interest rates of Europe apart from Italy, and that the balance of payments deficit is not only the worst in Europe, but unparalleled in our history.
Inflation will probably go up to at least 8% before it goes down. What will that do to the pay round and all the other problems which the Chancellor faces? I really think that he should have had the guts to come before the Commons with an autumn budget to correct some of the mistakes he made in his earlier budget and to face up to the implications of the course that he's taking.
The battle against inflation remains the government's top priority, and it's not due to start falling again until next year. In a confident performance this afternoon, Mr. Lawson reaffirmed that his economic strategy will remain unchanged.
The government is confident that the extra £2 billion for the NHS will persuade a group of its own backbenchers to support it in tonight's vote on the new charges for eye tests and dental checks. About 60 Tory MPs have indicated that they're unhappy about the proposed new charges. Ministers have told them there'll be no more concessions, and they're hoping the rebellion will crumble. Mrs Thatcher told the Commons during Prime Minister's questions that many people would be quite put out if they weren't allowed to pay. The latest arithmetic from Westminster tonight suggests that the new money for the NHS has headed off a backbench revolt. Ministers are saying the increase proves their commitment to the health service. A short time ago, a spokesman for the National Association of Health Authorities gave a cautious welcome to the announcement on funding, saying it did represent an increase in resources. Trevor Clay, General Secretary of the Royal College of Nursing, said it was the best news for the National Health Service for 6 years.
After a year in which the government has been under siege over the funding of the health service, Mr Clarke declared himself delighted with the extra money, which he said would allow for an increase in spending next year of 4.5% on top of inflation and over and above the cost of the Nurses' Pay Award. The health department say the extra spending will allow more money for hospital building, for expanded services for the growing numbers of elderly, and for the treatment of AIDS. But it's still only slightly more than the amount the Social Services Select Committee said the NHS had been underfunded by in recent years. Reaction from the opposition and the health unions seems set to continue the recent rows over health spending figures.
For the first time in 6 years, they've given us a budget that contains no cuts for the health service, but equally, it doesn't contain any growth money for the NHS. Our task next year is to get them to put back into the NHS some of that money they've siphoned out over the past half-dozen years.
We've still got major problems of poverty pay in our National Health Service, and I don't think the amount of money which has been talked about, welcome though it is, will necessarily cut the waiting queues for patients or in fact help people to get better faster.
Meanwhile, it remains to be seen how the announcement of the extra money will affect the threatened Tory rebellion tonight against the introduction of charges for eye and dental tests. Despite heavy pressure from government whips, the leaders of the rebel Tories said earlier their support was rock steady. But at question time, the Prime Minister made her opposition to the rebels' case quite clear.
Many people would feel it was quite wrong if they were not allowed to pay these small sums, which they can well afford, to enable substantial development in the health service to take place.
The whips and the rebels are playing at brinkmanship right to the last. On past form, though, enough Tories will pull back from outright opposition to ensure the government wins the day. But their usual 100-plus majority will fall sharply.
The Chancellor's statement contained the sort of detail which will keep economists up late into the night. The most important points are the adjustments to the forecasts he made in his budget in March. He's now accepted that inflation is higher, the trade deficit bigger than he'd expected. But overall, Mr. Lawson insisted that no other major economy had such sound finances.
In the city, the Chancellor's statement was monitored closely. As Mr. Lawson confirmed today, prices and imports have risen faster than he predicted in the budget. His critics say the changes in his forecasts show he's lost control of the economy. In the budget, this year's inflation was put at 4%. Today, he predicted more than 6% by Christmas. A major reason, the impact of higher mortgage payments. The estimated trade deficit in the budget was £4 billion. Now it's £13 billion for the year. The reason? Booming investment and growing consumption, according to Mr. Lawson. Investment in manufacturing, the Chancellor said, is rising much faster than the public's consumption of consumer goods. He's not very worried about Britain importing more than it sells abroad. The economy, he says, is sound. Growth was estimated in the budget at 3%. Now he reckons the economy will grow by 4.5%. Strong and steady growth, unmatched since the war, in the Chancellor's view.
What we are doing with this unprecedented position of a substantial budget surplus is repaying. We're in the process now of repaying the national debt. And that not merely means that there will be a lighter burden of debt interest on future generations, which is very important, but it also means here and now, because we have less to spend on debt interest, we have more money available to spend on the health service.
The Chancellor won't have silenced all his critics in the city. There are still fears that he'll be forced to raise interest rates again to regain full control of the economy.
In Belfast, 3 men have been given long prison sentences for their part in moving a big arms consignment for the Protestant paramilitary organisation, the UDA. David Payne was jailed for 19 years. James McCullough and Thomas Aiken each received a sentence of 14 years. More than 60 rifles and thousands of rounds of ammunition were among the weapons seized by the police in County Armagh last January. Today, the judge praised the police for saving the lives of many Catholics. A man has been committed for trial accused of the killings last March at the city's Milltown Cemetery. Michael Stone, aged 33, from Belfast, faces 38 charges in connection with the incident and other offences. 3 people died in the attack at the cemetery during the funeral of the IRA members shot dead in Gibraltar by the SAS.
An inquest jury has returned a unanimous verdict of death by misadventure in the case of a man who died while being arrested by police. Clinton McKerbin died from asphyxiation as he struggled with 2 policemen, and the coroner said this appeared to be nothing other than a tragic accident. Mr. McKerbin's death led to fighting between police and youths in Wolverhampton, where he lived.
Israeli warplanes have been in action again today, bombing Palestinian targets in Lebanon as Israel went to the polls. The Israeli general election has been dominated by the Palestinian question, and the violence of recent days seems certain to affect the outcome. In the last election, Labour under Shimon Peres won 44 seats. Likud, led by Yitzhak Shamir, took 41. But the remaining 35 went to fringe parties, forcing Labour and Likud into a coalition. Today's election has 27 parties taking part, with Labour or Likud needing 61 of the Knesset's 120 seats to take power outright. Neither will win that many, and as our Middle East correspondent reports, they'll try to do deals with the smaller parties.
In the absence of eve of voting polls, conventional wisdom has it that although the contest is still close, Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir has the edge. And Mr. Shamir, no doubt aware that under the proportional representation system, every vote counts, seemed to reflect that belief when he did his bit to stay in power. The campaign of his main opponent, Labour leader Shimon Peres, suffered a further setback soon after the polls opened this morning, when a car carrying Mr. Shamir's supporters was ambushed in Israeli-occupied East Jerusalem and petrol-bombed. 3 people were injured, 1 seriously, and dozens of Palestinians rounded up. That's the last thing Mr. Peres, with his message of dialogue and compromise with the Palestinians, wanted after Sunday's petrol bombing of a bus killed an Israeli mother and her 3 children. That attack brought a response from Israel today when aircraft bombed Palestinian positions around the Lebanese port of Sidon and close to the capital Beirut, killing at least 4 people and making that talk of peace a little bit more remote. at the same time emphasizing Mr. Shamir's position, crush Palestinian resistance. The right-wing message will probably appeal to undecided voters in places like the Israeli settlements on occupied territory. They feel particularly vulnerable to Palestinian attack and strongly about not giving up territory. And to the powerful Orthodox Jewish vote. They swing between Labour and Likud, but the family who died in the bus attack were Orthodox Jews, so they're probably not in a conciliatory mood. And if it's as close as the predictions, it will only take a few votes to decide, to talk peace or to act tough. This is Keith Graves for the 6 o'clock news in Tel Aviv.
A short list of sites for burying nuclear waste is to be sent to the government in the next few weeks. The list has been drawn up by the Nuclear Waste Disposal Authority, NIREX. Today they also published the results of research into safety at such sites. Our science correspondent, James Wilkinson, reports.
It has to go somewhere. Now I understand the possible sites for Britain's nuclear waste depository will almost certainly include the existing nuclear site at Sellafield in Cumbria, the Dounreay nuclear site in Caithness, and the Altnabreck site nearby. Today, NIREX briefed scientists, environmentalists and MPs on research which they say proves burying waste is safe.
People can be excused in thinking there's no science behind having solid waste 600 foot down below the surface. The story only starts there. What we demonstrate today is we've looked at what happens in 100 years, 500 years, 5,000 years, a million years, and understand all those processes so we can assure that man's environment will be safe from this activity.
Environmentalists still maintain they want the waste stored where it arises, despite claims that that would increase the risk to the public and workforce. But they're also worried about how the wastes arise.
Current government policies to continue reprocessing and to import foreign spent fuel which will be reprocessed, and the low and intermediate level waste will not be returned to the countries of origin but will be retained in Britain. This could be a major political problem when people recognise that we are becoming partly a radioactive waste disposal dump for the rest of the world.
Nuclear waste is mounting at the rate of more than 40,000 tonnes a year. Both sides of the argument accept that finding a place to put it is now becoming urgent.
Later in the programme, in Kipling country, why some Afghan rebels are doing a deal with the Kabul regime. And the dangers facing children who dabble in witchcraft. Now the time is 6:17.
The headlines tonight. In his autumn statement, the Chancellor says he's giving an extra £2 billion to the health service for the coming year. He's also increased spending on roads, prisons and defence. Labour's spokesman Gordon Brown has said the health increases will barely cover the basic cost of inflation. And Israelis have been voting in their general election as their warplanes stepped up attacks on Palestinian bases in Lebanon. One person has been killed and another 17 injured in a rocket attack on the Afghan capital, Kabul. The Soviet news agency TASS says all the victims are women and children. Afghan rebels have been stepping up their attacks around several cities, including Kabul, Kandahar and Herat. But there's evidence that the Soviet-backed Afghan authorities have made some unofficial deals with Mujahideen rebels in the western area around Herat. As our Asia correspondent Brian Barron reports, it seems they want to protect the withdrawal of Russian troops under the peace agreement signed earlier this year.
It's a scene that might have stirred Kipling. Tribal warriors rallying to the flag of reconciliation. But this is a fantasy for television devised by the revolutionary authorities as their appeals to the Mujahideen to join a coalition are predictably spurned. This is the western city of Herat, strategically near both Iran and the Soviet Union. Manhood here means owning a gun, and the authorities, dismayed by the Soviet withdrawal, dish out weapons to just about everyone over 15. But as this devastation shows, the Mujahideen are strong around Herat, often within earshot. Today, with its back to the wall, this Marxist-dominated regime preaches compromise, showing absolute tolerance towards Islam. And unreported by the state-controlled media, Here in Herat, it endorses local deals with the Mujahideen. There's nothing in writing, and it could vanish overnight like a will-o'-the-wisp. But the diplomatic assumption is this accommodation has been engineered by the Russians to safeguard their exit from Western Afghanistan. Shrewdly, the Russians hand out plenty of food for Herat and for those along the road on which they'll finally withdraw. Soviet troops still guard key bridges, for the Afghan army is plagued by desertion. How tribal loyalties can shift is shown by this armed group which switched sides 5 years ago to support the regime. What do they think about the Russians going?
It's our problem. If the Soviet Union withdraw or not withdraw from our province, it's our job to ensure peace in our province.
But once the Russians go, a long, stalemated civil war seems likely. This is Brian Barron for the 6 o'clock news in Western Afghanistan.
The South African government has banned the country's best-known opposition newspaper for 4 weeks. The Weekly Mail, based in Johannesburg, has been an outspoken critic of apartheid and recently reported allegations of police brutality. Publication has been halted under South Africa's emergency powers. It's being seen as the most concerted move so far against the opposition press.
In Geneva, the United Nations Secretary-General is chairing talks between the two sides in the Gulf War. Iran and Iraq are refusing to withdraw troops until they reach agreement about the waterway which runs between their countries. Iran says it already has UN backing for its claims, but Iraq disagrees and wants complete control over its main outlet to the Gulf.
20,000 teachers in Scotland have held a one-day strike to protest at proposed changes in the education system. They're members of the country's largest teaching union, the Educational Institute of Scotland. Today they marched through the centre of Edinburgh to oppose what they see as the anglicising of Scotland's schools.
70% of Scotland's biggest teachers' union had supported the call for a day of action. On a march through Edinburgh, around 7,000 took to the streets, amongst them some parents and children too. From the youngest ages, Scotland's education system is different. Children have a broader curriculum, face very different exams, ultimately often go to university younger than elsewhere in Britain. But new legislation expected shortly is seen by some as a threat to Scottish individuality. New opting-out powers, as in England, are likely to allow parents to vote their schools out of local council control. Moves towards a national curriculum up to 14 and testing of children at 7 and 11 in key subjects also mirror English reforms. So those on the march today believe such changes threaten Scotland's distinctive system.
Today what we are trying to do is to show that teachers are extremely concerned about Scottish education and give the lie to the Minister's statement that it's just one or two of us in the EIS who are concerned.
But Scotland's Education Minister believes there are fundamental problems to tackle in schools throughout Britain.
The idea that there aren't problems with the 3 Rs, with people leaving school without the necessary skills, literacy and numeracy, that is confined to England, is absurd.
After today's march and rally, union leaders claimed every school in Scotland had been disrupted. But more strikes are unlikely. The teachers promise a campaign to turn parents' minds against the government's reforms.
Power station workers who belong to the electricians' union, the WETPU, have voted against a one-day strike next Monday over the ban on trades union membership at the government's communication headquarters in Cheltenham. But they've agreed on limited industrial action, and shop stewards will meet tomorrow to decide what form it should take.
One of England's most senior judges, the Master of the Rolls, says the appeal court is having to hear too many civil cases which are doomed to failure. Lord Donaldson says he wants all civil cases to be screened by a judge in private to decide whether they're strong enough to take further. This, he says, would cut delays. At the moment, there's a backlog of 1,000 cases waiting to be heard.
Coventry has become the first city in England to introduce a ban on drinking in the street. The bylaws cover the city centre, where some shoppers and tourists had been frightened away. The Lord Mayor's deputy marked the start of the 2-year experiment, which followed a long campaign by local people for a drinking ban.
An attempt by the boxer Jim McDonnell to become Britain's third current world champion is to go ahead in London tomorrow. He's fighting the white South African Brian Mitchell, and the bout's been a focus of anti-apartheid protests. It's already been the subject of a court hearing, and now some local council staff at Southwark are refusing to prepare the venue. Our sports correspondent, Bill Hamilton, reports.
For 5 years, Jim McDonnell has been preparing for his chance, a crack at the world title. But it's the squabbling outside the ring that threatens to ruin his big night. With just over 24 hours to go, the preparations at the council venue in South London are in chaos. The seats lie stacked by the side of the hall, the television cameras remain outside. This afternoon, council workers were at the town hall to tell their employers they weren't prepared to get the hall ready because McDonnell's opponent is South African. Even though today the world champion insisted he was steadfastly against apartheid.
You know, I'm a sportsman, I'm the WBA champion, I'm representing the WBA, and I've got nothing against any black person in the world. I've never had anything against a black person.
But at Southwark Town Hall, further chaos. The council had decided to obey a court injunction, forcing them to honour their contract with the fight's promoters, yet at the same time excusing their own union members from having any part of it. So tonight it looks as though the fight will go ahead under the most bizarre circumstances, with one group of council officials inside preparing the venue, and another group who've been given the day off on full pay, saying they'll be outside protesting against it.
Bill Hamilton reporting. Super Channel, the British satellite television station, has been taken over by Richard Branson's Virgin Group and the Italian television company Video Music. Super Channel, which is received in 13 million homes across Europe, is said to have debts of around £60 million.
There's said to be a worrying increase in the number of children who are involved in witchcraft and the occult. According to the charity Childwatch, many become emotionally disturbed as a result. Some suffer physical and sexual abuse. Childwatch are calling for an urgent meeting with the Home Secretary. They say dozens of children are being referred to them for help each year, but many more are too frightened to speak out.
Tarot cards are among the most accessible paraphernalia of the occult. Together with Ouija boards, they're the commonest way for children to get hooked. For most, the rituals are no more than frightening games. The problems begin when a child is enticed into the shadowy world of witches' covens and mystic ceremonies, a world that has grown dramatically and secretly over the past few years. Caroline is a secondary school teacher whose teenage son burst into the house after a session with a Ouija board, saying he'd conjured up a demon.
Everything about my son was different. He just appeared that something had taken him over. He had a voice I didn't recognise. He was spitting, he was laughing. He just wasn't my son at that point. He grabbed a knife in the kitchen and attempted to knife his elder brother.
Caroline's son is now in hospital, a fate that Childwatch's founder, Diane Kaur, says is becoming increasingly common for children literally frightened out of their minds by their experiences of the occult.
We're getting evidence of this kind of satanic activity with children from all over the British Isles. And as we go deeper into it and do more research, it's a bit like Pandora's box. The more you lift the lid, the more comes out. We're very concerned about it indeed.
Barbara Brandolani is a witch, claiming to practice magic from the temple she's built in the front room of her house in Oldham. There's been no suggestion of malpractice by her coven. She says that if abuse does exist, it's the work of paedophiles using the occult as a cover, what she calls the black sheep of the craft. But the occult is now big business. This shop in Leeds claims to have 40,000 mail-order customers throughout the UK. Its owner, Chris Bray, is adamant that the vast majority of them are beyond reproach.
There may be a small percentage of people who use the occult as a front, if you like, but they have no occult powers as such. They are still criminals and they should be pursued under the criminal law.
The campaign to highlight the dangers of the occult has been joined by the Christian churches. The Reverend Kevin Logan carried out a survey of 300 children in the northwest. 9 out of 10 had had some experience of the occult. 6% were hooked.
In my own ministry, I come across the broken lives of teenagers and adults. We have to cope with them. After Halloween, we have to pick up the pieces.
Interest in the occult is booming in Britain. For those children drawn into its world of cult-like obedience, the effects can be devastating.
Report from Martin Sixsmith. And that was the 6 o'clock news on Tuesday, the 1st of November. Mrs. Thatcher was asked about the plan to charge for eye and dental checks. She said many people would be quite put out if they weren't allowed to pay.
Nigel Lawson gave his autumn statement on the economy. He told the House the measures were further testimony to the economic transformation the Tories have wrought.
But Labour's Treasury spokesman Gordon Brown heard the Chancellor's statement and said the prospects he promised in the spring are not the realities we face in the autumn. That's it from us tonight, but Michael Burke will be here at 9 o'clock. Laurie and I will be back at 6 tomorrow. Until then, good night.